She rolled her suitcase past gate B27. No fanfare, no one giving her a second glance. A tailored gray blazer, one carry-on, and the kind of confidence that doesn't need a name badge. She handed over her boarding pass. Seat 2A, business class, window view. She nodded politely to the flight attendant, slid into her seat, pulled out a book. It was a routine flight from Atlanta to Denver, and for about 10 minutes it stayed that way. Then, heels tapping, voice clipped, a uniformed man approached. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask. He told, "You're in the wrong seat." She showed him the pass. "I need you to move." A few rows behind her, someone began recording. What happened next didn't involve shouting. She didn't resist. She stood up, moved quietly, and changed the future of an entire airline. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about what people assume when they look at you, and what happens when their assumption costs them everything. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ for more true human stories that challenge what we think we know. And drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Because this story doesn't take place in the shadows. It happened in plain view. In a plane full of witnesses, and one quiet woman who turned an insult into an audit that would shake an empire. Now here's the part no one expected. She wasn't there to be seen. She was there to observe, to audit. It was supposed to be quiet, anonymous. But racism doesn't care who you are. Dr. Alana Royce, 46 years old, Atlanta native, mother of two, CEO of Aerovanta, the firm that audits federal airline contracts for safety, compliance, and ethical conduct. If you looked at her that day, you wouldn't have seen the hundreds of flights she'd flown. You wouldn't have seen the medals she earned as an Air Force pilot. You wouldn't have known she holds both a PhD and an MBA, or that her company had just signed a deal with international regulators worth nearly $3 billion. Because Alana didn't need to announce herself. She never has. In boardrooms, she was known for her silence before she spoke. The kind of silence that made people sit up straight. When Alana asked a question, the room listened, and when she raised a concern, contracts stalled. She didn't throw her weight around. She didn't need to. But outside those glass towers, at gates, in check-in lines and elevators, none of that mattered. There, she was just another black woman in America. And like too many before her, she learned that titles don't stop assumptions. She rarely flew commercial anymore, but this trip was different. Aerovanta had begun conducting spot audits, unannounced, undercover, fully internal. Her destination? Denver. The reason? A compliance review of Jettrans Airways, a regional carrier preparing for a multi-billion-dollar expansion contract. She booked the ticket herself, declined her assistant's offer to handle arrangements, used her corporate status, yes, but chose business class over first to sit among real passengers, to see what they experienced, to listen. She didn't want to be treated like royalty. She wanted to know if Jettrans treated people fairly, especially people who looked like her. The morning of the flight, her daughters, Lena and Ari, helped her iron her blazer. Her youngest, Ari, kissed her cheek and said, "Be invisible, Mama. That's what you always say when you want to catch them slipping." She smiled and told her daughters she'd be home in 48 hours. She never expected the audit to start before takeoff. Because somewhere between gate B27 and seat 2A, a uniform, a face, a tone, all of it collided with years of unspoken bias. A pilot saw her seated in a VIP cabin and made a decision. Not based on her name, not based on her title, but based on what she looked like sitting in that seat. They didn't see Dr. Royce. They saw someone who, in their minds, didn't belong, and they acted like it. What they didn't know is that Alana Royce wasn't just flying the plane. She was about to change the entire flight path of their future, and she hadn't even opened her laptop yet. Gate B27 was unusually quiet for a Monday morning. Most passengers were business travelers, buttoned up, earbuds in, half watching the news on the monitors overhead. Alana stepped forward when her group was called. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, received a polite nod, and walked down the jet bridge with the same calm she carried into every boardroom. She turned left into the business class cabin and found her seat, 2A, window. She slid her bag into the overhead compartment, removed a slim notebook, and sat down. Nothing about her presence was disruptive. She wasn't loud, She didn't demand attention. She simply existed in a space she had every right to occupy. But to one man, that alone was unacceptable. 10 minutes later, as the final passengers trickled in, Captain Raymond stepped out of the cockpit and walked directly toward her. Not to greet the cabin, not to speak with his crew, just toward her. He stopped by her row and leaned in slightly. Not friendly, not courteous. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move. These seats are reserved for elite status passengers and premium ticket holders." His tone wasn't aggressive, but it was dismissive. Sharp. Practiced. He didn't ask to see her boarding pass. He didn't ask her name. He saw a black woman in a business class seat, and in his mind, that was the only verification he needed. Alana looked up, calm but firm. "I believe I'm in the right seat. 2A, that's what's printed on my ticket." She pulled the pass from her bag and offered it to him professionally. He glanced at it and paused, just for a moment. Then instead of apologizing or correcting himself, he hardened his voice. "Regardless, you'll need to move. I need this seat open." There was no explanation, no justification, just a thinly veiled order. A man seated across the aisle lowered his phone. A woman near the front frowned and looked back. People were noticing, but no one said anything. Not yet, because no one wanted to be the first one to challenge a man in uniform. The flight attendant, a young woman who had been prepping drinks in the galley, peeked around the corner. The pilot turned slightly, muttered something to her under his breath. Her face stiffened. She looked at Alana, then back at the pilot. "Is there a problem with her seat, sir?" she asked softly. He didn't answer her, just stepped back and motioned toward the rear of the cabin. Alana stood slowly. She didn't argue, didn't demand anything. She picked up her bag, tucked her boarding pass back into her coat pocket, and walked the narrow aisle toward seat 21C, middle row back of the plane between two strangers. She had every right to protest. She didn't, but this wasn't compliance. It was strategy. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's calculation. The pilot disappeared back into the cockpit, the door shut, the plane continued boarding. In 21C, Alana unfolded her tray table, opened her notebook, made one note, circled in red, observed unprovoked reassignment from confirmed seat. Pilot Captain Raymond Ellis. It was just one sentence, one line in a field report, but it would become the line that started the fire. 2 rows ahead, the man with the phone was still watching her. The woman from earlier leaned into her husband and whispered something. People were uncomfortable, but not surprised, because they'd seen it before. Just not with someone like her. The flight took off 20 minutes later. The cabin dimmed. Drinks were served. The flight attendant stopped by 21C and leaned in with a slight apology in her voice. "Dr. Royce, I'm sorry. I didn't know. If I had." Alana shook her head gently. "You didn't do anything wrong." She closed her notebook and stared out the window. The clouds drifted by unaware. She hadn't raised her voice, but the system had spoken loud enough for both of them. The only question now was how loud her response would be. Because when that plane landed in Denver, it wasn't just the passengers who were arriving. The audit had already begun. Alana Royce didn't speak up on the plane. She acted later, in the language the airline would understand best: compliance, audits, and billions. By 7:36 a.m. the next morning, Jet Trans Airways received a certified letter, digitally signed and time-stamped. Sender, Dr. Alana Royce. Position, Chief Compliance Officer, Aerovanta. Subject, immediate initiation of special audit. Personnel conduct and ethical standards. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was an audit, a full-scale, internal, no-warning-required corporate investigation with federal weight behind it. The scope was broad and brutal. In-flight personnel conduct, racial bias patterns in customer handling, policy enforcement disparities by rote, executive awareness and training gaps across 18 flight sectors. The memo circulated through JetTrans executive Slack channels like a fire alarm. Phones started ringing. One internal email, flagged urgent, simply read, "We removed the auditor from her seat, and she saw everything." By noon, corporate attorneys were involved. By 3 p.m., someone leaked the video. The footage wasn't long, just under a minute. Shaky phone cam, background chatter, the captain standing over a seated black woman. No shouting, no physical contact. But the image was loud enough. The woman in seat 2A holds up her boarding pass. He doesn't even look at it, just points behind her. She stands up and walks away. That was it. But it was enough. Someone uploaded the clip to Twitter with the caption, "Pilot kicks black woman from business class. Turns out, she's their compliance auditor." By the end of the day, it had 2.4 million views. What struck people wasn't just the footage, it was the reversal. She had the power, he had the prejudice, and everyone saw the price of assuming. At JetTrans HQ, panic turned to paralysis. That evening, 3 board members held an emergency meeting with the airline's legal and PR teams. Damage control was top priority, but it was already too late. Aerovanta's name was trending on LinkedIn. Financial blogs had picked up the audit notice. Aviation Weekly called it the most costly misjudgment of personnel in a decade. The airline released a statement. "We are aware of an incident involving a passenger and a member of our flight crew. We are cooperating fully with all audits and take matters of conduct seriously." It didn't mention Alana by name. It didn't apologize. It didn't help. By midnight, major investors were calling. 3 stockholders pulled early. The company's valuation dipped nearly 5% in after-hours trading. Alana didn't write a public post. She didn't give a press interview. She didn't need to. Her silence was the statement, and that made it louder than anything the airline could say. Inside her Atlanta home, Alana sat with her 2 daughters at the dinner table. Her youngest, Ari, asked, "Did they figure out who you were?" Alana answered without looking up from her plate, "They will. Tomorrow." She wasn't wrong, because the audit wasn't just a formality. It was the beginning of something much bigger than Seat 2A. And JetTrans was about to find out just how deep their mistake went. 1 week earlier, JetTrans Airways had been begging for Alana Royce's signature. She'd flown to DC, shaken hands with their general counsel, reviewed draft agreements line by line. A $2.9 billion partnership was on the table. A joint audit and international compliance overhaul that would give JetTrans access to African and Middle Eastern airspace under new FAA provisions. Alana's team at Aerovanta was the key to that door. But now they were about to lose her, along with everything she brought. The morning after the video surfaced, JetTrans executive chat rooms lit up in full-blown crisis mode. The legal team was scrambling to assess risk exposure. PR tried to draft a second, more sensitive statement. It still didn't mention her name. But the truth had already leaked from someone inside. "We removed the Alana Royce from a paid seat in business class on a flight she was auditing while she was finalizing our compliance deal." That message hit the inbox of JetTrans CEO Gerald Wakefield at 8:04 a.m. The subject line, "Are we serious right now?" His reply, "Please tell me this is a joke." It wasn't. By 9:30, a private Zoom call was convened with Gerald, 2 board members, the VP of Regulatory Affairs, and legal counsel. They reviewed the footage, replayed it. Paused at the moment, Alana handed over her boarding pass, the one Captain Ellis never bothered to read. No one said a word for a full 10 seconds. Then, one of the board members muttered, "You're telling me we kicked out the woman who holds our future in her hands?" Another voice chimed in, sharper this time. "We didn't just kick her out. We humiliated a black woman who was conducting our audit, and we did it in public." It wasn't just about one seat anymore. It was about the pattern. And this time, the pattern was wearing a suit and holding the fate of their expansion in her hands. At Aerovanta headquarters, the tone was different. Quiet, focused, precise. Alana didn't call for a press conference. She didn't return messages from business reporters. She simply revoked the pending contract. Her legal team issued one statement to JetTrans's board. After careful review of recent events, and in light of violations observed during our unannounced audit flight, Aerovanta will no longer pursue a compliance agreement with JetTrans Airways at this time. The impact was immediate. JetTrans stock dropped another 6.5% by close of day. 3 institutional investors issued public statements expressing concern. A scheduled press event to celebrate the $2.9B audit partnership was canceled, quietly. Internally, Gerald Wakefield was on the phone all day, calling everyone from Aerovanta's general counsel to Alana's executive assistant. No one answered. Because the answer was already clear. She didn't tweet, she didn't rant, she didn't ask for accountability, she withdrew, and she watched the operation bleed from the inside. Behind closed doors, panic settled into something worse, shame. JetTrans had spent the past year pushing for DEI recognition in the aviation sector. Their annual report highlighted progress and partnerships. But when confronted with a black woman in a seat of power, literally, they defaulted to the same old script. A white pilot assumed, a black woman paid, and this time the cost wasn't hers, it was theirs. At Aerovanta, Alana sat in her corner office. The skyline of Atlanta behind her, unread emails glowing on her monitor. Her senior audit manager stepped in. "We're getting calls from other carriers. They saw what happened. They want to work with us." Alana didn't look up. Let them call. She closed her laptop. She wasn't chasing headlines. She didn't need to prove anything. She'd already done what she came to do. She saw the truth, how they behaved when they thought no one important was watching. But someone was, and they weren't just important, they were in charge. In the following 72 hours, JetTrans canceled 2 international expansion proposals, delayed 1 code-share partnership, and faced an emergency review from the FAA regarding bias training for all cockpit personnel. The financial bleed was public now, but the cultural wound, that was just beginning to show. Alana Royce never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything, and what it cost JetTrans was just the beginning. Later that week, Alana was home. The kitchen table was cluttered with textbooks, lunchboxes, and half-done math homework. Her oldest, Lena, sat across from her, flipping through a civics assignment. Her youngest, Ari, stood by the fridge holding a juice box. That's when the question came, quiet but sharp. "Mom, does being successful even matter if they still treat you like that?" Alana looked at her daughters. She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to, because deep down, they already knew. Even in a blazer, even with a doctorate, even with a multi-billion-dollar company behind her, she was still seen as someone out of place. Someone to be corrected. This wasn't the first time Alana had been underestimated, but it was the first time her daughters had witnessed it in real time, on their phones, in their feeds, with millions watching. And the sting was different now. The hard truth is, status doesn't shield black women from assumption, from profiling, from being told subtly or directly that they're too loud, too confident, or simply too present in spaces they've earned. It's not just Alana. It's not just the airline. Data from the ACLU and FAA show black passengers are 2.4 times more likely to be flagged for suspicious behavior by airline crew. In 2023 alone, 38 public complaints were filed citing racial discrimination by U.S. carriers. A 2022 NAACP report found that 71% of black business travelers reported at least one racially biased experience during air travel in the previous 12 months. Most of them don't make headlines. There's no camera, no viral moment, just silence, just someone getting moved, ignored, dismissed. She pauses. What if Alana hadn't been a CEO? What if she had been a student on her first flight, or a nurse headed to a conference, or a grandmother flying to meet her first grandchild? Would she have had the resources to launch an audit? Would anyone have listened? That's the question echoing across dinner tables, office break rooms, and social feeds. Because this story was rare, not because of what happened, but because of who it happened to, and who had the power to respond. At the same time, dozens of black professionals began sharing their own stories. A corporate executive told to wait by the gate while his white colleague was ushered through. A professor forced to show ID 3 times while boarding. A black mother asked whether she was traveling with the child she was holding. None of these people were breaking rules. They were simply breaking stereotypes. And for some, that was enough to justify suspicion. It's not just about racism in the sky. It's about what that sky represents: access, status, mobility, and the quiet fear in some people when a black woman sits too close to that kind of power. Alana never wanted to be a symbol. She wasn't trying to start a movement, but the moment became more than her. It became proof that discrimination doesn't shrink when you rise. Sometimes it gets louder. And when it does, you're faced with a choice: stay quiet or change the course of the flight. Alana chose the latter. 3 weeks after the incident, Alana Royce went public. Not with a press conference, not with an emotional video. She wrote. The piece appeared in The Atlantic with a headline that said everything without shouting. A seat doesn't define me, but it tells you everything about power. It wasn't a rage-filled editorial. It was quiet, controlled, precise. She spoke about what it meant to be presumed unworthy, even in a space she paid for. She questioned who gets to feel at home in the skies, and who is still expected to prove they belong, even when all the credentials are in hand. She wrote, "I have flown planes, I've written the policies others now follow. But when I sat in that seat, all they saw was someone who looked out of place. And when I moved, I did not surrender my worth. I simply made room to show them what it costs when your prejudice flies first class." The article went viral within hours. NPR invited her on All Things Considered. MSNBC booked her for the readout that same week. She declined most interviews. But when she spoke, it wasn't about herself. It was about every Black traveler who had been moved without cause, watched without reason, or questioned without respect. Her answer wasn't revenge, it was reconstruction, changing the system from the inside. She joined a new national task force on transportation equity and airborne discrimination, formed in response to mounting public pressure on the airline industry. She didn't just sit on the board, she helped write the charter. And with the backing of 3 other civil rights groups, she launched SEAT, Systemic Equity in Aviation Task Force. Its mission was blunt: track and publish data on in-flight discrimination, train crews on implicit bias and passenger dignity, recommend actionable standards to the FAA, protect whistleblowers in the airline industry. Within weeks, SEAT became a recognized watchdog entity. Because Alana understood something too many still ignore: that a single seat isn't just leather and legroom, it's a symbol of who's allowed to feel safe, who's allowed to be seen, and who's expected to move. JetTrans, under mounting pressure, issued a second statement, this time naming her directly. "We regret the experience Dr. Alana Royce endured on our aircraft. We are cooperating fully with all external audits and have begun immediate training evaluations." But it was too late to rebuild the bridge they burned. SEAT's first public report revealed that JetTrans had received 6 prior internal complaints related to racial bias over the last 18 months, none of which were made public, and none that resulted in employee discipline. That revelation only deepened public distrust. More than 20,000 travelers signed SEAT's pledge to document and report discriminatory incidents. The FAA requested an initial review of training materials from every regional carrier, including JetTrans. Alana never intended to lead a movement, but when the opportunity came, she didn't hesitate, because she understood that power means nothing if it stays quiet when it matters most. And for her, silence was never the end goal. It was the pause before action. In one of her few interviews, she was asked what she would say to Captain Raymond, the pilot who ordered her out of seat 2A. She didn't hesitate. "I'd say thank you for showing us that the work still isn't done, that there's still a gap between policy and culture, and for reminding me that my seat at the table doesn't end at 30,000 feet." She smiled, not bitter, not triumphant, just focused, because now the system had her full attention. Some people wait for justice, others bring it with them when they board. The story didn't end when the headlines stopped, because what Alana went through, what she exposed, wasn't rare. It was just rarely answered with power. Across the country, people began to speak up, some for the first time. Comments flooded in. "This happened to my mother last month. She was flying to visit her sister in Houston. Same tone, same look, moved from her seat with no explanation. I was told, those seats aren't for you. I was in uniform, Army. They didn't care. They just saw my skin." Others found courage in her silence. "Her story gave me the strength to file a complaint against my airline. I thought I was crazy. I thought it was just me. It wasn't." That's what her story did. It peeled the silence back. It made people realize they weren't imagining it, that there was a pattern. And this time, the pattern had a name. In classrooms, on TikTok, in corporate DEI meetings, her name came up. Students cited her in research papers. Activists added SEAT to their resource guides. Black professionals began to share travel warnings among themselves, not just about safety, but about dignity. And then there were the messages from young women, some just starting careers in aviation, engineering, or compliance. One wrote, "I didn't think there was space for someone like me in this industry, but after watching what she did, I'm applying for my pilot's license." Another said, "Now I know I don't have to just survive these spaces. I can lead them, Because Alana didn't just sit in seat 2A, she occupied it, with every Black woman who ever felt unwelcome in a place she earned her way into. A few months later, Alana was invited to speak at an industry internship summit hosted by a consortium of regional carriers, some of whom had once overlooked her presence. She stood at the front of a quiet room filled with young faces, diverse, eager, uncertain. She didn't use a script. She just looked out over the room and said, "Don't wait to be invited forward. You already belong there. Speak clearly. Stand firm. Know that you are not alone, even when they make you feel invisible." The room was still for a moment. Then came applause. Not loud, but steady, respectful. It wasn't just about changing airline policy. It was about shifting the atmosphere, so the next Black woman wouldn't have to explain herself before she even sat down. Because the truth is, every person who watched that video saw something they recognized, either a moment they lived or a moment they allowed to happen. She lets the thought sit. How many voices have gone unheard? How many people moved to the back quietly, just to make it through the day? In that question, there's an invitation for all of us to listen, to speak, and to stop asking people to shrink themselves just to stay in the frame. What Alana did wasn't just powerful. It was personal, and her quiet resistance became something far louder than the moment that provoked it. By the time the next quarter closed, JetTrans had lost 3 international partnerships. One was with a cargo conglomerate out of South Africa. Another, a cross-market expansion deal with a major logistics firm based in the UAE. The third, quiet but most devastating, was a pending merger with a global fleet leasing operation valued at $1.7 billion. The companies pulled out one by one. Their reasons weren't angry. They were strategic. "We require alignment with anti-discrimination practices and visible corporate accountability," one partner wrote. "Reputational risk is not an expense we're willing to absorb," said another. Behind the curtain, stockholders grew louder. Demands for leadership change mounted. Eventually, the board moved. The JetTrans CEO issued a formal public apology, the kind that came with legal language, carefully rehearsed remorse, and a commitment to diversity, transparency, and future training. But the damage was already logged. Not just in dollars, but in dignity lost. The FAA launched a review, not just of JetTrans, but of crew conduct standards across all regional U.S. carriers. For the first time, internal bias reporting became part of the agency's annual safety audits. Airlines were no longer just being asked how well they flew. Now they were being asked how fairly they treated the people they flew with. And while all of that unfolded in press statements and compliance briefings, Alana Royce returned to work. Not with fanfare. Not with a book tour. Just a schedule, a team, a purpose that had sharpened, not shaken. She didn't speak about the pilot again. She didn't bring up JetTrans in her meetings. But those closest to her noticed something had shifted. She was still calm, still composed, but her boundaries had changed. Her voice, measured as always, now had less pause when confronting resistance. Her eyes didn't ask for space anymore. They took it. She didn't need applause. She didn't need revenge. She needed the system to wake up. And when it didn't move on its own, she handed it a reason. Sometimes, resistance looks like protest. Sometimes it looks like silence. But every now and then, it looks like a woman sitting in 2A, refusing to apologize for taking the seat she earned. At SEAT, the Systemic Equity in Aviation Task Force, intake numbers tripled. More whistleblowers came forward. One airline revised its escalation training protocol, naming her case as the model failure. And still, Alana stayed mostly quiet. Because the work was loud enough now. The ripple she created moved through policies, procedures, and perceptions. But most importantly, it moved through people. Passengers who stood up instead of shrinking down. Employees who finally filed complaints. Executives who had to reckon with what they had ignored for years. And all of it started with a flight, with a seat, with a woman who said nothing in the moment and changed everything afterward. Power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits quietly in seat 2A and rewrites the rules. If you were moved by Alana's story, share it. If you've lived something like it, tell it. And if you've never seen it happen, ask yourself why. Have you ever been judged by how you looked before they asked who you were? Before they heard your name, your story, your purpose? If so, you're not alone. Your seat matters, your voice matters, and your story deserves to be heard. Share it in the comments. Speak for those who still stay silent just to get through the day. And if you've never experienced it, ask yourself, have you ever stood up for someone who has? This is Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, where real stories live and quiet power speaks louder than hate.